International Relations, lecture number 6, Neo-Marxism. Marxism, as it has been developing in the 19th and 20th century, basically has ended up being two things. On the one hand, it is a political project, a project of the emancipation of the working classes, and a project of bringing about a society that is able to be more just, equal, and without class repression. On the other hand, Marxism has always been something of an analysis of the workings of capitalism, economically and culturally. The political project of Marxism was of big interest in the 1960s and 70s, but lost a lot of popularity at the end of the 1980s with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War. The really existing socialisms had proven to be a failure, and the idea of communism being the quintessential expression of Marxism, the Marxist project sort of lost a lot of legitimacy among global audiences. That is not to say, though, that Marxism as a political project has lost all support. Even though we live now in times of neoliberal transformations, most of what we have in terms of welfare states come out of a social democratic or moderately socialist political ideology that has still a lot of legitimacy and power in our Western societies. However, it is in academic world that Marxism has actually received much more attention than before after the end of the Cold War, particularly because of this neoliberal globalization period that we're in and the way it has intensified the capitalist order. So studying the workings of capitalism from a Marxist perspective have become very popular ways of thinking international relations, and particularly by thinking about the ways in which international capitalism spreads power relations over the globe, but in a way that is very unstable and unequal. The origins of Marxism obviously lie with the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and focuses a lot on the economical relations that come out of capitalism. So this is what Marx called historical materialism, basically the analysis of the development of capitalist modes of production. And in his work, Marx shows how capitalism becomes a socially dominant factor in our societies in the 17th, 18th, and particularly 19th century. Whereas before we had agricultural societal relations, now the production of goods becomes the central social factor, creating social power relations in our societies, particularly the role of factories and the role of machines that are able to produce things. So in capitalism, the social foundations of our society revolve around the modes of production, the way we produce stuff, rather than God or the church or nobility, for instance. So social relations are being defined in capitalism in terms of economic production. And this is particularly visible in the way it splits and pits capitalists, the bourgeoisie in Marxist jargon, against the working class. In the analysis of capitalism, Marx makes absolutely clear that there is a fundamental conflict of interest between the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the workers. How does this work? Well, it should be put up in front that this analysis of the tension between capitalists and the workers has nothing to do with capitalist greed. It has nothing to do with the idea that capitalists are somehow evil people that are greedy and they just want to take from the workers. Marx's analysis is not an ethical analysis. It is an analysis of the economy. And he shows that actually, indeed, capitalists will end up taking what is not theirs from the working class, but simply because they do not have a choice, not because they want to. So, what happens? Well, capitalists, they have factories, and they've got a lot of people working there, quite a few machines as well, right? And the workers actually sell their labor in exchange for wages. In principle, Marx argues, what your productivity is exactly how much money you should get for that. So that you would get an equal amount of money for how much you put in. However, under capitalism, capitalist elites are not able to give you that money. They will have to give you less. Why? Well, because of competition. Competition forces them to invest in their factories, to actually make annual or at least regular investments in which they buy more equipment, more machineries, to make the process more efficient so that they can keep up with the competition. This element of competition is new. It didn't take place in agricultural societies. So because capitalists need capital for reinvestment in their factories, they have to appropriate part of the wages of the workers to invest in the factories. So this means that workers are going to become poor and actually end up living under subsistence level. But there's more, because the capitalists end up investing this appropriated wages into the factory by buying more equipment and machinery. This means that they will need less labor, so they can fire a couple of their workers. This implies that the next round they'll have to appropriate the same amount of wage from the workers, but there are fewer workers, so they have to take more of those workers in order to be able to invest the same amount of money in the next round of modernization of the factory. So you can see that we end up in a race to the bottom, where we have a situation that there are fewer and fewer workers on the workplace. They're going to be exploited harder and harder, and the machines that they will have will take their jobs, up to the point that the factory can't make it anymore, and it goes bankrupt, and will end up in a crisis of the market of that specific set of goods, through which a whole bunch of factories will go bankrupt, and then the system restores itself again, but there will be fewer factories left. They will start over again, and the same process will continue and continue. So the capitalist system in this way forces a breakdown of its own functioning, leading to cycles of boom and bust. But after each of those cycles, you'll see that there are fewer and fewer players around on the market. There's a process of enterprises becoming bigger and bigger and dominating the market more and more. While at the same time, through these cycles of boom and bust, larger parts of the proletariat end up living in a state of verelendung, of living in horrible subhuman conditions. At a certain point, this will escalate into a revolution, and then will enter the stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is roughly, very roughly, Marx's analysis of capitalism. Important to stress here once again is that this analysis is based on the inevitable structure of capitalism and has nothing to do with greed or evil CEOs that want to be the wolves of Wall Street. There is another side to capitalist system that is being analyzed by others, particularly in the 20th century, and which has to do with what has been labeled hegemony. And this idea of hegemony has been developed by early 20th century thinker Antonio Gramsci, who wrote most of his work while being imprisoned under the Mussolini regime in Italy. And he asked himself, what went wrong with the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat? Because we did have a revolution in 1917, but it was in Russia. And Russia was far from an industrialized country in which the capitalist system had taken over most of the societal relations. Rather, Russia was an agricultural state that had hardly any substantial industry. So the revolution did take place in Russia, but it didn't take place in northwestern Europe, exactly the place where capitalism has rooted the deepest. How is it possible that the proletariat didn't understand its own interests? How is it possible that the proletariat missed out on the evident fact that they are being exploited in the capitalist system? Gramsci's analysis started off with the idea that the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, aren't simply in political power over us, over the people. It's not as if they just control the military and leave us at ourselves. Rather, the bourgeoisie is also in control of several key cultural institutions in our society: the church, education, the media, mass politics, etc., etc. And through these institutions, Gramsci argued, the bourgeoisie has been able to impose a set of cultural values upon the workers, their own values, presenting those values as universal. So what happens is that in fact we are being blinded by the cultural, political, economical elites through our cultural institutions into a state of meekness, a state of acceptance, a state of thinking that actually the world that we're in which we are being exploited, is a just world and it's just fine. To give an example, the American dream would sort of fit to be one of those cultural tropes that is being played out in this way, right? So the American dream is the idea that everyone can make it, and therefore if you don't make it, you're just a loser, right? Those who have made it are those who have made it on their own power, on their own strength, and if you lose, it just happens to be a result of you being a loser. Well, if you take a peek at American society, you'll see that there's a large part of the population that is actually losing from the game in terms of staying behind, having poor education, having poor social welfare arrangements, having poor insurance, etc., etc., being off really bad. But this doesn't lead to societal unrest, partially because the American dream is such a strong idea in the American mind that it actually naturalizes misery as my own fault. Right? This is I'm just making this example of myself, but you could argue that in this way culture can actually make us understand our own misery in terms of a natural order, just as we used to have that before capitalism, when the church told us that human misery is simply the will of God. So important here in hegemony is the idea that we're not just being oppressed from above, but rather that there's cultural values being fed to us from the cradle off, and that we're actually internalizing them. They become part and parcel of our everyday life. And therefore we have collectively naturalized exploitation as a normal state of affairs instead of revolting against it. So this means that we end up having two strands of Marxism: the material economic analysis and a much more cultural analysis. The material analysis developed into what has been labeled world systems theory, which studies the economic ties between the industrialized world and what we usually refer to as the third world. The cultural aspects have been developed by the Frankfurt school mostly, and focused on the way in which capitalism naturalizes itself through culture. Neither of these two brands are strictly IR, they are also part of sociology, etc., but IR has substantially drawn from both of them. World system theory, the material analysis of capitalism, derived from what has been called dependency theory, or in Spanish, Dependencia, a school of thought which developed in the 1950s and 60s from South America, analyzing the big question of how is it possible that despite all the liberal theories that we have, the third world simply doesn't seem to be closing the gap with the industrialized world. How is it possible that we're lagging behind so much and we don't seem to be getting any closer to the developed world, if you will? So dependency theory analyzes the economic relations between what they call the center, the industrialized world, and the periphery, the third world or the developing world. And it analyzes the way in which these two blocks of countries trade with one another. Both produce, but they both produce different stuff. In the industrialized world, in the center, we produce manufactured goods. We've got factories that produce highly state-of-the-art kind of technology, right? Anything from cars to equipment to high-tech stuff. The periphery, on the other hand, the developing world, produces mostly raw materials. Those can be fuels like oil, stuff we need for production in the center, like iron ore or copper, etc. But also consumables such as coffee, tea, and sugar. You have to understand that this is a very strict separation that still, despite globalization, seems to be very strong, right? If you nowadays would go to Colombia, which is one of the biggest coffee producing countries in the world, right? And you would buy a cup of coffee, you would probably not be aware of the fact that the coffee, even though it might be coming from Colombian beans, actually has been produced in Great Britain, right? And that Colombian coffee beans are massively shipped over to Great Britain, where they are produced into actual coffee and then being shipped back to Colombia for consumption, leaving most of the profits behind in Great Britain. So, on the basis of this analysis of a center having productive power of manufactured goods, right, and the periphery only being able to produce raw materials, Three sets of arguments were roughly made in the 1950s and 60s. There was a set of historical arguments, namely that if you look at the way which prices develop over time, you'll see that manufactured goods prices rise steeper than the prices of raw materials, meaning that the center which produces manufactured goods actually historically gains more from what it does than the periphery. A second set of arguments was much more economic, and for instance focuses on what has been called the elasticity of income. Roughly the argument is, if I were to gain twice as much money in my wages as I do now, so suppose my wages double, I would probably consume more, but I would probably not consume twice as many bananas or drink twice as much coffee. More likely I would buy myself all kinds of high-end equipment, gadgets, and high technological stuff. So this implies that if the center becomes richer, it will probably consume more manufactured goods, which is good because that's what they produce, so they'll only improve their own markets. However, if the periphery becomes richer, they too will probably buy more manufactured goods, which means that it will be a boost for the economy of the center rather than of the periphery, and actually that they will have to import those manufactured goods, which is very expensive, which would then cost part of that extra wealth. So this means that if the center grows economically, this will have a positive effect on the growth of the center. Whereas if the periphery grows economically, it will have also a positive effect on the growth of the center, and actually a dampening effect on the growth of the periphery itself. Meaning that the gap will widen and widen. Finally, there's a class-based set of arguments made about the relations between the center and the periphery. The idea here is that there's tensions within the class system. How does that work? Well, both the center and the periphery are divided up between elites and proletariats, or working class. Right? Elites are friends globally. They like each other. They play the same game. So the leaders, the economic leaders of the center are very closely related to the economic leaders of the periphery. They don't have a conflict of interest. Workers, of course, have a conflict of interest with economical elites, with the bourgeoisie. That's the same in the center. We have a conflict of interest with our CEOs, and in the periphery. All of that is not a problem, but the problem resides in the relations between the proletariat or the working class on the one hand the center and on the other hand the periphery. One would say that since both of us are being exploited by our elites, we would share the same interest, but that's not what actually happened. What actually happened is that in the Western world, social democracy has led to a situation in which the working class has been able to demand or enforce certain levels of affluence, of luxury. And the economical elites have allowed this by actually transferring the exploitation from our center countries to the periphery countries. Or in other words, we as Western consumers are just able to make sure that our coffee and our shoes are really cheap. And the low prices of those products come at the cost of the wages in the global south. So, in the end, it is the working class in the center that contributes to the exploitation of the working class in the south by demanding very cheap products coming out of the periphery. And this way, exploitation has been transferred globally. It has been softened in the center because the center allows for a certain level of affluence at the cost of the workers in the periphery. So, world systems theory has particularly been articulated in international relations by Emanuel Wallerstein, who has been working on its development for several decades, and has, for instance, added the category of a semi-periphery into the analysis. A semi-periphery, which would be a country that has some industries and sort of takes a middle position between the center and the periphery, which then helps to mitigate the tensions between the center and the periphery. So that the tensions in the periphery between the overexploited working class and the economical elites don't spill over to the center. Wallerstein also developed the idea of cyclical rhythms, which is basically what we discussed earlier, the idea of boom and bust cycles, in which this global system leads into self-conflict. It is self-defeating, it breaks down into a crisis, then picks up again, goes into a cycle of boom again, but then breaks down again. And this is a sort of a cyclical rhythm that keeps pounding on and on. And he also added a longer-term trend on what he called secular trends, which is basically the way in which the cyclical rhythms develop. And for Wallerstein, it's very clear that those trends are going downwards, right? So even though we are still in trends of in cycles of boom and busts, the cycles will become shorter and shorter, and the bust will go deeper and deeper. And in the end, the whole system somewhere, some point in time, will come to a grinding halt. The cultural element of Marxism has been developed mostly by the Frankfurt School in the 1940s and 50s by Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer, and later on by Habermas. And it understands our current day capitalist societies as societies in which we are profoundly alienated from who we really are. There is a lot of alienation and symbolic violence going on in our societies, but it's almost impossible for us to see because it's become part and parcel of the everyday life that we live. It's like the water that we swim in. It's very difficult to actually see that. This kind of thinking has taken all kinds of forms. One of the ways you could think about it is how much of a competition culture we have developed, in which winning and losing is part of pretty much everything that we do, and we're sort of constantly in a rat race where we're fighting against ourselves to perform better and better and better. Otherwise, if you don't do it better than someone else, you'll be a loser, right? This is why we have university colleges. This is why we have honors educations, why we have higher education to begin with, right? So there is a constant battle for competition, which we naturalize through Holland's Got Talent, and all kinds of sports and cultural practices that reinforce in our minds the idea that competition is natural. It's just human. And if it hurts, it's not bad, it's not evil. That's just part of life. Another kind of brand of analysis has been done in regards to our relation with nature, right? Whereas a couple of 100 years ago, without romanticizing the past, we would be able to have a meaningful relation somehow to animals, plants, and nature in general, we would know animals in a meaningful way. We would be able to communicate with them in a sort of a practical way. But we would not just understand nature as a stockpile commodity for consumption. Right? Nowadays, our societies are so far away from nature that we actually put down artificial farms to show our children what a farm would look like, except that those artificial farms, children's farms or kinderboerderijen in Dutch, resemble nothing of what real farms look like nowadays. Real farms have become industrial complexes, right? So even in trying to introduce nature to our children, we have to make use of a completely a nostalgic image of how we deal with nature. Having completely lost the ability to meaningfully relate to plants and animals, etc. You only have to spend like 15 minutes on the internet to see how problematic even our relations to our pets have become, where pets have become the site of the inscription of human behavior, which we would then try to, or which we then make as a place for our own amusement, right? So we project upon kittens human action, make a picture of that, and then put it online in order to see how incredibly cute it is that the kitten behaves like a human. And this kind of alienation from from our own relation with nature, and we are, of course, nature, and the idea that nature to us only has become something of a stockpile commodity for consumption, has led to a whole practice of self-alienation that we find very difficult to see. So, critical theory in many ways looks at the ways in which we alienate ourselves from ourselves, in which our culture makes us naturalize certain violent practices, at least symbolically violent practices, as normal. And it focuses a lot on issues such as instrumentalism, how in capitalist societies we start losing the ability of appreciating things for what they are and only appreciate them for what they yield us, for their benefit to us. So work, for instance, rather than being something like a meaningful practice of self-expression, of something that you are a carpenter or someone who builds beautiful things, becomes replaced with something like a career, a set of goals that you have to fulfill in order to get societal status and monetary income or monetary welfare, and we have to pursue careers as if there's some intrinsic value to it, whereas we completely overlook the idea that in pursuing the career we're not actually in touch with our work in a meaningful way, but only in an instrumental way, leading to waves of mental breakdowns and midlife crises in our societies. Similarly, we reduce love to dating on a marketplace, not even to mention pornography, right? Or our ability to enjoy ourselves becomes restricted basically to 3 weeks or somewhere in summer on a beach, and we have to very artificially be able to relax in a usually also very stressful way. Okay, so critical theory looks very much towards the ways in which capitalism has created a certain kind of culture. This will be expanded on a couple of podcasts from now, when we'll focus more on critical theory and the way it has been translated into international relations. So, in our Marxism initially took a lot of cues from historical materialism, and there was a lot of emphasis in the 1970s and 80s on world systems theory. However, after the Cold War, you see a boom of Marxist work, particularly in the direction of critical theory. And several authors started to connecting the material analysis with the more cultural analysis. One of them is a set of authors, Negri and Hart, who have written a book in the late 1990s called Empire, and several follow-up books after that, which actually analyzes globalization as a form of empire, in which there is not a one state that is in charge of a global empire, but empire is something, the way in which late modern capitalism organizes all kinds of forces on a global scale. So, for instance, there is a role for United Nations for legitimizing certain kind of political practices. There's a role for the United States as acting as a policeman when states or other actors step out of bounds. There is a role for international culture and the internet for legitimizing all kind of cultural practices, and so on and so on. So for Negri and Hart, the current global order is one in which capitalism has created a cultural set of institutions and practices that sustains its own being without us actually noticing it. Simultaneously, you see that there's a lot of emphasis in Marxist work in IR on the role of civil society. How do we actually find ways of resisting the cultural practices of capitalism? Here there's a lot of emphasis on how to organize bottom-up resistance without falling into the trap of becoming just an extension of those in power. So these are schools of thought thinking about what extent can civil society become global, extend itself beyond states, work through the internet maybe, develop a new modus operandi, try to stay away from the traditional bastions of political power, and develop new ways for resisting and changing the logic of our capitalist mode of production. Finally, some questions. First one, do you have to be a Marxist to do Marxist work? It sounds like an innocuous question, but I think it's important to think about how theory and the researcher actually relate with one another. Right? We've seen, of course, in the case of feminism, that there's something of a similar kind of relationship. It's at least very unlikely that if you do not share the sets of assumptions, or at least the ideological sensitivity of the theory, you would actually end up doing research in that direction. The question is whether that's necessarily the same for Marxism. Second, world system theory understands global economy in terms of countries, in terms of groups of countries of a center and a periphery. Nowadays, under globalization, we see a lot of different forces emerge. Non-state actors, companies that are incredibly flexible, that can move across the globe, etc., etc. We also see that there is a move of technology, of technological production away from the center towards what was usually called the periphery. In certain countries, you see that high-tech industries are booming even though they are still developing countries. So does this mean that world system theory is simply outdated or obsolete? Thirdly, Western societies are all about freedom. We are free and equal societies in which we have democracy, and we've, at least in our common understanding, reached the sort of the pinnacle of human development, right? Gender equality, racial equality, everything has been sort of maybe not perfectly yet, but to a large extent been taken care of. Critical theory would actually say no. actually we're just not seeing a lot of the symbolic violence and even non-symbolic violence that we're engaged in. Since we're so used to our culture and our own values, we're just missing out on the ways that they are doing violence to us. Interesting question would be, what kind of testing procedure could we develop? How could we see whether the one is true and the other is wrong? Would we even be able to do that? And finally, the question of agency. If Marxist analysis is right, and we are living under a global system of capitalist production which create not only material relations between center and periphery or between bourgeoisie and working class, but also the cultural practices that legitimize that order, what can we possibly do? To what extent could we distance ourselves from our own culture?